那我们开始说从 CBT 认知行为疗法说起。CBT 可以说是一线治疗，它很有效，而且呢相对来说也比较容易懂，所以我比较喜欢讲这个。如果你对这个已经有了解了 ，bear with me，OK？ So CBT is
一线治疗，就是说，医生就是首
first line
首选。
对 yeah. Usually when somebody's anxious or depressed, this is where we start usually. So CBT is based on the fundamental principle that the way we think affects how we feel and the way we behave. 就是我们的认知，我们的思维主宰我们的情绪和行为。认知就是指我们对事情、对自己以及对周围世界的这个理解和见解。So when we have bad feelings and destructive behaviors, it's not really the situation itself that makes us feel bad or do bad things. It's more how we think about that situation. So a quick example, let's say you're waiting to be seen by your doctor. You're waiting in the waiting room and it's 30 minutes past your appointment time and you're getting really impatient. Now, if you're thinking, this is ridiculous. Why do they have no respect for my time? They clearly don't care. They just want to make more money, so they book more people. Then you're going to be feeling what? You're going to be feeling angry. You're going to be feeling frustrated. Maybe you're going to be feeling mistrustful, impatient. And so how's that going to affect your behavior? You may be grumpy. You may be demanding with the office staff. Some of you may actually just get up and leave and never come back. Some may sit and stew in silence and then carry that negative energy to the rest of the day and maybe lash out at somebody else later. But if your thought at this point is, wow, this doctor, he's really popular. He's in demand. Everyone wants to see him. He must be a pretty good doctor. I'm pretty lucky that I got an appointment today, at least. This brings about very different feelings, right? You may actually be feeling lucky. You may be feeling full of gratitude. Or you might think, this poor doctor, he's so overworked, or this, there must be some really difficult case going on that's taking up so much time. That's usually what I think, because I know that if I have a really difficult case, sometimes I go beyond the appointment time. So my mind goes to, oh no, something's bad's going on. So at this point, you may be feeling concerned. You're probably feeling more empathic, and your behavior will show that. Now, if you behave in a grumpy and confrontational manner, you're going to piss people off. The office staff, they're going to get mad at you too if you act all pissy, right? So they could really get disrespectful with you in return. And then you get more angry, more grumpy. And then you fulfilled your own prophecy. So you see your thoughts, your emotions, and your behaviors, they really feed off of each other, sometimes in this vicious loop. So to disrupt that loop, we can intervene anywhere in this triangle, any point you can intervene. But the focus of CBT, the soul of this method, is that you focus on find thought distortions that give rise to negative feelings, and you replace distorted and dysfunctional thoughts with more balanced and realistic thoughts that are based on real evidence as opposed to based on our fears and projections. So this in turn leads to fewer negative feelings and healthier behaviors. We're not saying erase all bad thoughts or feelings and just pretend everything's great, everything's sunny. It's not that. It's about realizing when we're focusing too much on the worst case scenario and engaging in unhealthy thinking patterns. So how do you know if your thoughts are distorted? You ask a bunch of questions. Like in this case, if you're thinking, they really don't care about my time, they disrespect me, that's why they're late. Maybe they're sitting there eating a big lunch or on the phone or something. You ask yourself, well, are there other possibilities? So these questions, are there other possibilities? Could it be something else going on? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? And what's the most likely scenario? Do you have any evidence for or against these thoughts that you're having? And how does this way of thinking serve you? Is it helping you in the moment, or is it hurting you? And then you take a step back and you say, if it's not me in this situation, if it's someone else, what would you tell them? How would you counsel them? Right? So these questions, they make us evaluate our thinking process. They make us reassess, 就是我们这个思维的这个是不是合理？它强迫我们进入这种 Sorry, I'm switching back and forth Chinese and English. 它强迫我们进入这个就是逻辑思维的这个状态。当我们进行逻辑思维的时候，我们的情绪就已经稳定下来了。因为用逻辑思维的时候 ，we're using a different part of the brain, the prefrontal lobe, our amygdala, the emotional center has to quiet down because we're redirecting our energy to a different part. 那么这个时候我们就没有那么暴躁了 ，and we're able to see things in a more balanced manner. So while we're focused, like I said, we're focused on thoughts and thought distortions, it's also important to realize that sometimes we're not even aware that certain thoughts are popping up. You know, what we're usually aware of is the emotion, the feelings part. We know that we're agitated. 我知道我发怒了，让我等这么久，我当然要发怒，对不对？ But we may not be aware that the real problem is that the way we're interpreting the situation is we're not respected, we're not valued, we're helpless, there's nothing we can do. And what makes one person interpret the situation as being a helpless victim who's not respected, while another person thinks of this as, oh, I have a pretty popular doctor. Or another person thinks, oh, this poor doctor is so helpless and overworked. Why do people have such different automatic thoughts? It comes down to our core beliefs about ourselves and the world around us. If we tend to believe that our value comes from other people's validation, if we feel that we have little control, then we tend to see situations through the lens of worthlessness and helplessness. How do we change that? We recognize our thought distortions and reframe them, but more importantly, we need to examine our core beliefs and ask, are these beliefs really consistent with how I want to be and how I want to feel? So we identify our thought distortions, we challenge them, and then we also want to think about why we have these kinds of thoughts. What are our core beliefs? And is my core belief that I'm helpless, I'm not in control? Is that why I keep thinking this way? So let's take another example. Let's use another example to kind of drive this home. Let's say we have our client today. Let's say our client is Alice. All right, Alice, I'm going to use your name. Let's say Alice, she walks into a restaurant, 进入一个餐馆 ，OK， 然后她发现一个 corner 有一个男子给她一个很奇怪的目光，好像是敌意的目光，让她一下子就不自在了。那我们先从 feelings 开始啊，就是说，因为 feelings that's the most immediate kind of recognizable thing that we have, okay? So 这个时候 Alice 的 feeling 可能是什么呢？可能是 anxiety 紧张，可能是不安，可能是困惑，可能是 shyness 那个害羞。那我下一步我们就要问，就是 what thoughts made her feel this way? All right. The way we search for these thoughts would be, we ask, 我在想什么？我害怕会发生什么？那 what kind of thoughts is Alice having at this moment? I'm just going to guess. And feel free if you want to type down some thoughts that you think could be contributing to her feelings. But I think, you know, she might be thinking, 这个人是不是看不惯我？他是不是不喜欢我？是不是我什么地方做的不对，我 offend 他了？是不是我穿的不得体，让他这样子来看我？是不是我的行为让人家觉得讨厌了？是不是别人觉得 maybe I don't belong here, right? So these are the different types of thoughts that she may have that makes her feel that way. So once we've identified these thoughts, we pause and we ask a bunch of questions about these thoughts, right? So one of these thoughts was 这个人他不喜欢我，他看不惯我。那么我们就问，我们有证据吗？我们的证据可能就是他这个好像敌意的目光，也许我们曾经有过这样的经历，曾经被别人这样敌意的看过，然后事实证明那个人就是对我们很凶，不喜欢我们。那我们下面一步就是要问 So does your past experience, is that enough evidence for what's happening right now? Do you have clear evidence that this person was really looking at you strangely? Did you see his face clearly even? How closely did you look at him? Are you sure he's looking at you, or maybe he's looking at somebody behind you? Or maybe he's not looking at anything in particular, but maybe just having a bad day, probably. Or maybe even let's entertain the possibility. Maybe he's looking at you because you're beautiful. Maybe he's looking at you because he's attracted to you and he's just kind of an awkward guy. He can't help himself. He's just kind of staring, right? That's also a possibility. So at this point, we have listed quite a few alternative explanations for the situation. We've asked for evidence. And what we're really doing is just stepping outside of our narrow focus on the worst case scenario. And we're seeing things in a more balanced light. 会不会有可能这个人就不喜欢我，对我很敌意？当然有这个可能，但是这不是唯一的可能。There's a lot of other possibilities. So when we're looking at all these possibilities, we stop focusing on the worst case scenario. 然后我们就不会无止境的沉浸在这种负面的情绪里边。So let's go to the worst case scenario, okay? In this situation, it would be that this guy really has something against Alice for whatever reason, and is giving her a mean look. We ask, so what? So then what? Does one person's mean stare have to ruin your meal? Would it be possible still to socialize in the restaurant with your friends despite one person being quietly angry with you? Let's say you end up not having a good meal. You couldn't really socialize because you're self-conscious because of this guy. Does this have to ruin your evening? All right. Even if it ruined your evening, even if your evening turned into kind of a bummer, then what? Does this have to ruin your life? Does this have to destroy you? Right? It's kind of ridiculous when we kind of, pull it into these kind of strands, but sometimes that's what we have to do in the worst case scenario. So what? My evening is kind of sucky, but it doesn't have to destroy me. Right? Do you have to be liked by everyone to be a functional human being? So what if this guy doesn't like you? No, we don't have to have everybody like us, right? We may not like the fact that someone doesn't like us, but ultimately we're going to be okay. We don't have to be liked by everyone. If he doesn't like me, it's his problem, right? It's his loss. So again, this is, is an example of when you engage in this kind of thinking of stepping outside of that narrow focus and asking all these other possibilities, you make yourself think more logically, and then you calm down that fight or flight brain that otherwise would be taking over. Okay, so again, CBT helps us identify thought distortions that cause negative feelings and maladaptive behaviors. Oh, I forgot the behavior part, right? So if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling kind of scared because of these thoughts that you have, it's going to affect how you behave. You're going to be more self-conscious. Maybe you don't talk as much. Maybe you leave the restaurant, and then you're really going to feel kind of crappy, right? Because this did ruin your night versus, okay, maybe he likes me. Maybe he thinks I'm cute. All right, I'm going to be more flamboyant. Maybe I'm going to talk louder. Maybe I'll have a more fun evening. So again, there's this feedback loop here, and the way you think, the way you feel affects how you behave, and vice versa. So CBT helps us identify thought distortions. There's some very common thought distortions that whether or not we're, ill, we all have these thought distortions, but some of us do this more than others. So some examples here, black and white thinking. For example, if I don't get into this college, then I'm a total failure. That's black and white thinking. Or let's say I'm on a diet and I'm watching what I eat, but today I ended up eating a little more than I wanted to. I might say today was a total failure. It's a lost cause. At this point, I might as well just pig out and eat everything because the day is ruined anyway, right? Black and white thinking kind of ruined it. Mind reading is another common one. That's kind of what Alice did in this last example, right? I can tell this guy doesn't like me. Well, how can you tell? Sometimes we can tell, but oftentimes we're not very good at judging what people are actually thinking, but we think we can. We do this mind reading. Another one, overgeneralization. For example, he disagreed with me on this topic, so he's going to disagree with me on everything. That's an overgeneralization. Catastrophizing. For example, okay, I'm going to use myself as a catastrophizing person. 就是说，如果我的今天这个 presentation 有个地方没有讲清楚，或者我用错了一个词，中文没有讲好，那人家会觉得我是个笑话，那以后就没人信任我了。那我诊所还怎么开了？我诊所开不下去的话，那我以后生活怎么办？我孩子生活怎么办？完蛋了！如果我这个 presentation 里边有不完美的地方的话，那我们家的前途就毁了。So this is a totally exaggerated way of catastrophizing. It sounds ridiculous. But believe it or not, we all do this from time to time, and some of us do this all the time without realizing it. Once we've identified our thought distortion, then what we need to do is reframe that distorted thought into a more reality-based and balanced thought. Okay, so with my CBT patients, I will often ask them to do a thought record in between sessions. This is a way for them to keep track of their thoughts and to keep track of some of their common thought distortions. This is like homework for them. You should feel free to do something like this yourself. If you just Google Cbt Thought Record, you'll find all different types of forms online. But this is something that I use. You just write down what's the situation that triggered a certain feeling. You write down what kind of feeling you have, and then you document like common distortions, and then you look for evidence and counter evidence, and then you reframe your thought. So it doesn't have to be this format, but something like that. The important thing is you keep practicing it. You do it to a point where it becomes automatic. Okay, so that was kind of a quick overview of CBT. As awesome, I love CBT. As awesome as CBT is, sometimes it's not enough. Some of us just can't benefit from it. Why? Because CBT emphasizes change, which comes from identifying what is wrong, our thought distortion. And this emphasis on change and finding distortions can feel invalidating, can feel like rejecting people's current experiences. And sometimes it may create hostility between the patient and the therapist. So you can see constantly being pushed to think and act differently is kind of hard, and it could be annoying for anyone. But even more so if somebody is already suffering tremendously and in a state of crisis. And also just for people who are really, really sensitive, they may perceive this constant push as rejection, as ongoing rejection and criticism. As a result, they may have a very hard time engaging in this kind of therapy. And that's how DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, was born. So DBT is actually a modified version of CBT that incorporates acceptance of things as they are. So dialectical means integration of opposites. It means balancing acceptance and change so that we can look at two very different perspectives and think of them as both being valid. So acceptance in this case is achieved through validation of somebody exactly as they are in the moment. The DBT therapists really believe that everyone is doing their best that they can given their unique circumstances, and that their feelings, however destructive they may be, have validity. And yet with that, they guide the patient towards change. So the acceptance part of DBT has its roots in Zen Buddhism, with the idea that we accept reality as it is without attachment, without judgment. This acceptance applies both to the therapist in that they fully accepted the patient as they are in the moment, but it also applies to the patient in that they radically accept their reality as it is. All right, no matter how sucky this reality is, they accept it as it is. It is what it is. Through this acceptance, the therapist and the patient, they're no longer on opposing sides. They're joined together and they work towards change together. And the change part involves principles of CBT, which we talked about, as well as a lot of other problem-solving strategies. So this balancing of opposite sides in DBT is captured by the idea of walking the middle path, which is actually a Buddhist concept as well. Embracing the middle path means that opposing views can be valid at the same time. So no one has the absolute truth. So we better all be open to alternative ways of thinking and stop blaming the patient, stop blaming each other. All right. So DBT is the opposite of black and white thinking. It's the opposite of all or nothing thinking. So, for example, we can both engage in self-improvement and practice acceptance. Even if I'm fighting with my husband right now, we can both be right. I could be right and he could be right. I could be independent, but I could also accept help. I can take care of myself and engage in self-care, but also be someone who cares for others. I can have very conflicted feelings. I can hate somebody, but I can also love them at the same time. And both of these feelings can be equally as valid. So dialectical behavioral therapy consists of 4 skills modules, and 2 of them involve acceptance. So they're the mindfulness and the distress tolerance modules. The other 2 modules are change-oriented. They include emotional regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. So mindfulness is the practice of being fully aware and present in this one moment. It involves meditation practices and learning to focus on one thing at a time without judging yourself or others. Distress tolerance is about how to tolerate pain in difficult situations and not change it. This may be very helpful for people that have destructive and impulsive behaviors like self-injury. It teaches you constructive and in-the-moment alternatives. These could include things like distraction and other self-soothing techniques like deep breathing exercises or listening to music, etc. Emotional regulation means decreasing vulnerability to painful emotions and changing emotions that you want to change. And finally, interpersonal effectiveness means how to ask for what you want and say no while maintaining self-respect and relationship with others. All right. So because we've already spent a lot of time talking about change because of CBT, I want to focus more on the acceptance piece right now and talk a little bit more about the acceptance modules. So starting with mindfulness, what does it mean to be mindful? It means being aware intentionally in the present and without judgment. If we're not aware, we operate on autopilot. This can cause us to drift into past regrets or future worries and leave the present. We've all had experiences when we had one thought that led to another, and then before we realize it, our minds have taken over. You know, it could go from my kid forgot to clean up to he is so irresponsible to how is he ever going to manage life on his own to I failed as a parent, right? Can go like that really quickly. And as a result, instead of assessing what's really important and figuring out what you need to do in the moment, our minds have completely taken over and we feel out of control, resentful, and helpless. When this happens, we're not being mindful. In DBT, there are 6 core mindfulness skills. They're divided into the what skills and the how skills. So to be mindful, we first observe. We observe what is around us and what is inside of us, like our thoughts and feelings. Then we describe and label these observations. The act of describing helps us stay in the present. It also helps us take a step back from our thoughts and feelings. So instead of saying, I'm so angry, I can't take it anymore, you label it as, I'm having a feeling. That feeling is called anger, and that anger is pretty intense. You can also say, I'm having a thought, and that thought is that I might not be able to handle my anger. So again, you're labeling. This helps you detach from that thought itself and that feeling itself so that we don't drown in these thoughts and feelings, but we recognize them and we figure out how to manage them. All right, so we observe, we describe and label, and then we participate fully. We often try to multitask. And in that process, our minds go all over the place and we miss out on the present. So when we practice mindfulness, we pick an activity and we fully participate in it. All right, so these are the what skills. And then we have the how skills. We take a non-judgmental stance. We naturally judge, we're human, it's natural to us. But when we practice mindfulness, we take the judgment out of it and we stick to the facts. So instead of saying, I feel awful, I'm ashamed, you can say, I'm having a feeling. My chest is heavy, my heart is beating fast, my face is red. You stick to the facts. And then we act one-mindedly. We don't multitask. This is kind of like the fully participate. We do things one-mindedly. We don't eat and watch TV. We eat and focus on the food. We focus on the taste and the texture. We don't talk to our kids while looking at our phone. Not that I don't ever do that. Sometimes I do that. But when we're trying to be mindful, we don't do that. We focus on them one-mindedly. All right. And we choose effective behaviors. If something isn't working for us, we don't get mad at ourselves. We don't punish ourselves. We don't blame ourselves. We switch gears and we try something else. So there's so much to mindfulness, and it's a huge part of DBT. So I'm just kind of providing a bird's eye view and a quick intro to mindfulness. One way that we can cultivate mindfulness is through meditation. One of the simplest way to meditate is actually to focus on the breath and breathe in and out using your abdomen. Abdominal breathing means that you're intentionally expanding, pushing out your belly when you breathe in and contracting your belly when you breathe out. So you don't have to worry about this, but for those who are interested, this is actually really neat to take a look at what actually happens when you breathe with your belly. When you inhale and you push out your belly, you're lowering this thing right here called the diaphragm. What happens is that this diaphragm, this muscle that sits on top of your stomach, and it's right at the bottom of your lungs. You don't see the lungs here, but lungs would otherwise be here. When you're inhaling and you're pushing your belly out, the diaphragm moves down. So this muscle moves down. So like you're pushing on a balloon and the balloon pops out, right? So the belly pops out. But when the diaphragm moves down, it also increases the lung volume. So it draws air in. And then when you exhale, you lift the diaphragm up, you're engaging the diaphragm, and that causes your belly to contract, and then it expels all the air out of your lungs. Not only is this a more efficient way to fully expand and contract your lungs, so you're doing good air exchange, what's really cool about this is, I don't know if you can see, but you can see some yellow branches here. These are branches of the vagus nerve. And these branches, they ride on the esophagus and they go through the diaphragm and they go innervate your stomach. So when you move the diaphragm up and down, you're stimulating the branches of the vagus nerve right here, and you're activating them. And what happens when you stimulate the vagus nerve or branches of the vagus nerve is that you're activating the parasympathetic system. And that's the part of your central nervous system that's responsible for relaxation, what we call rest and digest, as opposed to the sympathetic system, which is responsible for fight or flight. So when you engage your abdomen, when you use your diaphragm to breathe, you're actually massaging parts of the vagus nerve, and that helps send relaxing signals throughout your body. And you can't help but feel relaxed. You can't help but have your heart rate be lowered and your blood pressure be lowered. And when our bodies are relaxed, our minds can also quiet down. All right, so one way to practice abdominal breathing, I know some of you already know this very well already, but for those of you who don't, one way to practice this is to put one hand on your chest and then another hand on your belly. So two hands against your body. And when you breathe in, you want to feel the lower hand move out and in, and the upper hand should move very little, if anything at all. So if you're feeling your bottom hand moving out and in, and your upper hand is not moving very much, then you're appropriately expanding and contracting your abdomen. It may not feel natural in the beginning, but it takes practice. Again, don't get mad at yourself. Don't blame yourself. Just practice it. Sometimes it's easier if you lay on your back and put your hand on your belly. Then it's easier to feel the rise and the fall in your belly. Takes practice, but it's well worth it. Abdominal breathing can be a very miraculous way to lower stress levels and feel more relaxed. And it's a very good way to bring a state of mindfulness.
就是腹式呼吸的话，是那个肚脐眼那一块要鼓起来。
对，
你吸气的时候。
对 ，exactly.
这样可以帮助你放松，从那个神经方面有一些解释。
对。So controlled abdominal breathing, it's a basic meditation technique that I just talked about, okay? So when we focus on the breath, our body relax, our minds will not run wild. We're more likely to stay present and not run to a future, all right? I have a little cartoon here to illustrate how mindfulness can actually help. It's very simplistic, but I think it can demonstrate the point. Let's say there's something that's very stressful and anxiety laden. And when we're not in a state of mindfulness, our minds go to, what if this happens? What am I going to do? What if it doesn't work? How can I fix this? What if? So a lot of thoughts just kind of, pop up automatically. We're on autopilot, and we can very quickly become overwhelmed and get into a state of crisis. And we start to think, I hate myself. My life sucks. It'll never get better. Tantrum, right? So we can be in this kind of a state if we're not mindful. However, if you take a mindful approach, if instead you don't drown in these thoughts and you sit down and you kind of detach yourself and you make observations and labeling, you can say, I'm having a thought. My thought is that my life sucks. I'm having a feeling. That feeling is I'm feeling sad. I'm having this behavior of I'm wallowing. So instead of becoming one with these thoughts and feelings, you take a step back and you observe them and you label them. And then you can say, all right, well, having made these observations, what is an effective thing to do? Is wallowing really effective? Maybe I should go for a walk instead. Right? So then you can more likely maintain the presence of mind to make a decision about what to do. So you're not operating on autopilot. You're mindful about what's happening, and then you can pick an appropriate coping strategy. So we've been talking about mindfulness. Let's also talk a little bit about this part, distress tolerance. So again, distress tolerance means getting through difficult situation without making it worse and accepting reality as it is. We do this through something called radical acceptance, which means completely accepting with our minds, our body, and our spirit that we cannot change the present, all right? This doesn't mean approval, and it doesn't mean resignation or helplessness. It means that we recognize that the pain is inevitable in life and that we will endure it because we're human. so that we don't constantly go, this is unfair, how can this happen to me, why is this happening to me, etc. When we do that, we intensify this pain and we enter into what we call a stage of suffering. So there's a difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable because we live an unpredictable life, there will be pain, but this pain can be intensified if you constantly question it, if you constantly say it shouldn't happen, why is it happening, then you start really suffering, all right? And we suffer less if we just accept this moment and let go of the expectation that it has to be different. Another way to think about this is, when you stop fighting reality, you free yourself up so that you can focus on what you can control instead of fighting what you cannot control. Only then can you take your first steps towards change, right? So we stop fighting with reality. All right, so we accept reality. We are not fighting it. This frees us to sit with the distress. But what if this distress is too intense? How do we get through it? How do we tolerate intense distress? DBT is all about different coping skills and different, tolerance skills. One of them, I'm going to share here, acronym TIP. So you tip the temperature of your temperature with your face in ice water to kind of calm yourself down fast. It's instant stimulation and it can help to shock you and calm you down. So sometimes I can have people hold their breath and put their face in a bowl of ice water, or just hold an ice pack to your eyes, to your cheeks, and hold it there for 10 to 30 seconds. Intense exercise, this can calm down your body when it's really revved up by emotion. Engage in whatever intense exercise you like. It could be a run, it could be doing jumping jacks, it could be playing basketball, whatever. Just get that intensity out of your body. Paced breathing. This is kind of like the belly breathing, the abdominal breathing that we were talking about before, but you do it intentionally and really, really slowly. In general, we want to breathe out more slowly than you breathe in. So for example, you can do 5 seconds breathing in, hold, and then 7 seconds breathing out. It's helpful to have the exhalation be a little bit slower than the inhalation. When we get really anxious, we have a tendency to engage the chest muscles and then to breathe fast and hyperventilate. We feel like we're trying to get all the oxygen in. But when we hyperventilate, we can actually make us feel even more panicky, and we make ourselves feel like we're losing breath, we're losing air. What happens when you hyperventilate is that the CO2, carbon dioxide level in your body goes down. And when that level goes down, you really can experience dizziness, you can experience palpitations. A lot of panic symptoms are actually related to not because we don't have enough oxygen, but because we don't have enough carbon dioxide, because we're breathing too rapidly. So breathe out very slowly, breathe in slowly, and don't breathe too fast. Breathe slowly and deliberately. For some people, it may be helpful to breathe into a paper bag so that you're recycling that air. For some people, it may be helpful to, close down one nostril, have your mouth closed and just breathe through one nostril. These are all techniques to slow down the breathing so you don't hyperventilate and deplete your CO2. These are examples. There are many other DBT distress tolerance skills. If you're interested, you can go to a DBT site to learn more. There's a lot of free resources. My last slide will have links to some of these sites to look more closely at these strategies. One DBT technique that may be worth mentioning is a behavioral chain analysis. This may be helpful if you have kids that have problematic behaviors, helpful for any of us really. It basically traces each step leading to a problem behavior that you want to avoid. So here's an example that I actually pulled from one of my clinic sessions where the problem behavior was smoking marijuana, smoking weed. And this girl, when she smokes weed, she knows that it makes her anxiety worse. It makes her feel really guilty. It makes her not very productive. So these are consequences. She really wants to avoid this behavior. So we were doing chain analysis because over Easter weekend, she ended up relapsing and smoking again. So we talked about what happened.
为的就是大麻是吧？
大麻，对， smoke weed, yeah. So she was saying, the behavior is that she smoked weed, and then we listed the behavior, and then we listed the consequences. And then I asked her, so what happened right before you smoked weed? She said, well, I went to hide in my room. Why did you hide in your room? Well, I went to hide in my room because I was feeling really, really overwhelmed. Why were you feeling overwhelmed? I was feeling overwhelmed because I was afraid and I was ashamed. Why? Because, you know, it was a large family gathering. There were a lot of people there for the Easter weekend. I was afraid that they were going to judge me. I was afraid that they were going to ask me all kinds of questions. You know, I'm not in school anymore. Are they going to think I'm stupid? You know, I feel like a failure. So the prompting event was that there was a large family gathering. And then there were a bunch of links from this prompting event that led to the problem behavior of smoking weed. And then we start with vulnerability. What are some of the vulnerabilities that make you more likely to engage in this behavior? In her case, she has a history of addiction. So that already makes her more vulnerable. She also has a history of paranoia. So it makes her more likely to get anxious when she smokes weed. So this chain analysis, what it does is that it helps you see at what stage in the series of a sequence of events can you intervene. You can intervene at any one of these points, right? So if you see that hiding in your room makes it more likely that you'll smoke weed, then, you know, when you're feeling the overwhelm, find somebody that you trust, be with that person. Don't go into your room alone. If you know being in the room alone in a state of overwhelm makes you very likely to smoke weed. If you know that, you know, certain situations like large family gatherings or parties or whatever is likely to make you feel afraid and ashamed, then plan ahead. Either don't attend them. If you have to attend them, find a way to make an exit. Find a way to respond to people if you anticipate certain questions. Maybe think about, you know, am I engaging in thought distortions when people talk to me? Prepare ahead and prepare yourself against thought distortions. If I tend to be a mind reader and project certain things from people, then I will make a decision to not do that when I'm in this kind of situation, right? So when you analyze the sequence of events, you realize there are various points when you can break that chain so you can avoid that problem behavior. You can use this for any problem behaviors, whether it's substance abuse or overeating or self-injury. A lot of times people struggle because they feel like I'm out of control. I don't know why I do these things. There's no reason why I do these things. But when you make them do this chain analysis, they realize, oh, actually, I did this because of this, because of this. And so it gives them a sense of control also over all these events, because then you know why you're doing this. And then you can avoid certain stressors and you can plan ahead. So I think this is kind of a valuable tool that we can all use. And if you have children that have behaviors that you want to correct, maybe this is something you can do with them as well. I'm looking at the time. We're about at 1.5 hours. 我们差不多时间到了，对不对？我们想留一点 time for question and answer. The next couple slides that I have, I don't think I need to go over. These are kind of, these are other skills in DBT that are more change oriented and very kind of straightforward. And, you know, I can let people look at them, you know, in their own time. If you want to look at the presentation later, you can find all of these too if you Google DBT. So maybe I don't need to go over these things. What do you guys think? Maybe we can then see if people have questions.